Hey everybody, welcome to our penultimate video for popular culture. That means we have this one and one more only. So congratulations for making it this far. It's not going to get any harder. I think Baudrillard was the hardest it will get, and if you sort of understood that, even if you understood about 50% of that, I think you'll find this reading a lot easier. So let's get to it. So I want to start off, usually I like to surprise a student and I ask for a volunteer to read, which, in class would usually be a sentence or two. And then I give them this sentence to read, which is only one sentence technically. But this is how Dick Hebdige begins the excerpt that we're reading for class. And I want you to think about how it relates to popular culture and the postmodern condition, or postmodernism. It might not make sense at first, but I promise you it will as you start to think about it and as we start to unpack some of this. And that's all I want to do today, is think about some of the main points, because we could get into the nitty-gritty of postmodernism and have a whole class, so like a whole course on postmodernism and still not maybe understand it. But let's think about how he begins and why he might choose to. So he writes, let's see if I can do this. When it becomes possible for people to describe as postmodern the decor of a room, the design of a building, the diegesis of a film, the construction of a record, or a scratch video, a TV commercial, or an arts documentary, or the intertextual relations between them, the layout of a page in a fashion magazine or critical journal, an anti-teleological tendency within epistemology, the attack on the metaphysics of presence, a general attenuation of feeling, the collective chagrin and morbid projections of a post-war generation of baby boomers confronting disillusioned middle age, the predicament of reflexivity, a group of rhetorical tropes, a proliferation of surfaces, a new phase in commodity fetishism, a fascination for images, codes and styles, a process of cultural, political, or existential fragmentation and or crisis, the de-centering of the subject, and an incredulity towards meta-narratives, the replacement of a unitary power axis by a pluralism of power discourse formations, the implosion of meaning, the collapse of cultural hierarchies, the dread engendered by the threat of nuclear self-destruction, the decline of the university, the functioning and effects of the new miniaturized technologies, broad societal and economic shifts into a media, consumer, or multinational phase, a sense, depending on whom you read, of placelessness or the abandonment of placelessness, critical regionalism, or even a generalized substitution of spatial for temporal coordinates. When it becomes possible to describe all those things as postmodern, or even simply using the current abbreviation as post or very post, then it's clear we are in the presence of a buzzword. Thank you for listening to all of that. That is the first sentence that you're given in this excerpt, or at least one of them. And it tells us so much, obviously, but it also, as any good postmodernist will do, and I'll try to define those things in a moment, so don't worry, but it also embodies what it's talking about and performs what it's talking about. So the ideas that we'll talk about in a moment are actually put into practice and presented to you through the way that they are presented. So not just the words are describing this idea of postmodern, the words themselves are postmodern, which is a very post or postmodern thing to do. So we've talked a lot about postmodernism now, and maybe I hope you'll see connections to things like Baudrillard, who says that we've kind of stepped away from any sort of reality, and now we're in hyper-reality. So we could easily, although I'm sure people would disagree, replace hyper-reality with postmodernism and be talking about much the same thing. As Hebdige critiques, though, when we can apply postmodernism, this idea, to everything, then maybe it means nothing. And I think it means something in between. I know certain people, certain academics really hate this idea or this term, or think it's been, a buzzword for way too long. Personally, I kind of like it. I still like it. And I like it because it does what it says and it says what it does. Not a lot of theories do that, not as consistently and as well and as openly as this one. And so I kind of like it. It can be what I would call mischaracterized by saying nothing matters, it's apolitical, if you're postmodern, you're useless. I don't think that's true, but it definitely means that there's not a super text or a grand narrative that we can turn to. So, if you're a Christian who believes in the word of the Bible, then you can turn to the Bible and you can say, the Bible says this and therefore it's true, right? If you are a constitutionalist and you think that the Constitution is the end-all be-all of law, you can turn to the Constitution and say, look, it's in or it's not in, therefore this is true. And we can do this in many ways, right? In some cases, when we're little, we go to our parents and say, my dad said this is happening, therefore it's true, right? So we always kind of rely on this idea of expertise and this idea that there's somebody else or there's another entity that we can turn to and prove ourselves. Postmodernism says, effectively, there's none of that. We are making this up, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It means if you do something good or bad, or you try to justify something as good or bad, you can't turn to a outside text or a person, whether that's the Pope or whether that's the president or whomever, right? You can't turn to that person and says, well, he or she says this, or this book says this. Instead, you have to come up with it, or you are coming up with it. You're constructing it based on other things, perhaps, but you have the responsibility of saying what is or isn't true, or what truth even is, and if it exists, as opposed to relying on somebody else. That's how I see postmodernism, or at least in its best guise, that's how I see it. But there's a video I'm going to post that hopefully helps explain some of this, so I won't get into all of it because I don't want to repeat it. I think if your head is about to explode now, maybe pause this and go to that other video first. It might be a little easier or more accessible. But I want to engage with this idea of style and what Hebdige is interested in. And he really points to a few movements that changed significantly over time. So when you think about it, right, for a long time we were, as a civilization, or many civilizations, in the dark ages, meaning we relied on stupid ideas, really, if you want to be honest, and we did things based on what we were told to do, usually by some king or pharaoh, like we sort of discussed earlier with Marxism. And so that's how things progressed until what we call now the Enlightenment. And one of the main key tenets of the Enlightenment was the idea that we need to scientifically question everything and prove, or at least support, ideas, as opposed to just doing it because the older guy in the neighborhood or in the village says so. And so that led to so much discovery so quickly in a relative time frame that it's night and day, human civilization before and after the Enlightenment. And so a lot of those ideas have continued, but we've gotten so good in some cases, not necessarily if you're looking at American politics, but in many cases we've gotten as a society so good at questioning things that we're even questioning the idea of questioning things. And so that's when we're starting to get kind of postmodern. You'll see what I mean. But let's think about modernism. A lot of people, when they think of modernism or when they describe modernism, refer to works like Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And we can see it here. It's obviously a really modern, or modernist now, painting, because unlike the historical sort of mythological or biblical figures that you would see in paintings, once modern art or contemporary art started to appear, we get all these challenges to what art even means. What does it do? What's the purpose of art? Picasso and many others, especially when we think about it in Cubism, broke down the form of women and of people and of places, and did different images that sort of were from different angles, but at the same angle because it's one painting, and broke down time and space in all these crazy ways. That was modernist painting because of the sort of time period, but also because of this idea of throwing out all that tradition and pushing things to see where they would go. And we see this with James Joyce's Ulysses and works of modernist literature. We see this with buildings, some of the great modernist buildings, architecture. But by the time we get into the 60s, really, and it's hard, I don't want to say like this year was when it was modern or postmodern, but that was relatively recent, right? Modernism. And it seemed very new. That's why it's called modernism. But once we get into the 60s, let's say, just as a time reference, that stuff was kind of old already, right? And people were learning it in school in this traditional way. Like, this is Picasso. He is a great painter. And so that kind of makes it all stop seeming so new and so modern. And so what we do is we get into this whole thing with postmodernism, where we've gone from modern and now we're in this new area of culture where, you know, somebody can put a toilet, a urinal, in a museum and sign it, and it's art. And somebody, same person, can put the Mona Lisa with a mustache and a rude sign, if you know how to read in French. He can put that in an art gallery and that becomes art, right? And there's all this questioning of like, what are the boundaries and what does anything mean anymore? And there's this explosion of meaning and this idea that we can play with meaning to the point where nobody knows what the hell is going on. And that's kind of postmodernism. So if you are asking yourself as I'm talking, as you're listening to this video, what the fuck is going on, then maybe you're dealing with somebody or something postmodern. Maybe. But the point is, yeah, there's no authority that speaks for it, which means you can't even really define postmodern, because a true postmodernist would say it's open to interpretation and play. There's no grand narrative here, right? So you can't even explain it, which gets very difficult to explain what you're talking about, because we are dealing with postmodern ideas or postmodernity, but we're also not saying like, here's a box and this is where postmodern stuff fits, and here's another box and where it doesn't fit, because then you're doing the opposite of what postmodern is, which is playing with ideas and past experiences and a teleology. So let's get to that. So there's a few things that I want to bring up that hopefully will help. And so Hebdige points out that postmodernism is against totalization. The way I think of this, I mean, here's some examples that come from me. There was this idea of philosophers, I think, early on, knowing everything or trying to know everything as much as they could, right? The more you know, the better. But now, and I say now as if, you know, let's just accept maybe that we're in postmodern times right now. Now we know that we can't know everything. In fact, it's so hard to know everything, anything really, because of all of this fake news and all this simulation, that we don't even know what knowledge is anymore, really, right? You can debate this, and this is where we are now. So we've gone from let us study and know, and, you know, we can develop Euclidean geometry, and we can develop science in this area, and we can develop a philosophy of metaphysics. Now we're just like, I wish I just knew what the fuck was going on in the world, right? That's postmodern. You think of the old school museums, like the British colonialist often, museums, libraries. You would collect all of these works, all of this knowledge. The early encyclopedia would try to bring all of the knowledge to France and to other places. And what you get is this collection of stuff with this sort of idea that if you collect enough, you'll know everything. You'll have everything. You'll possess everything. And, you know, colonialism was a good example of that. They try to possess the world as a British or colonial power. And totalization, being against totalization, kind of just points to the fact that no, there's never going to be a library or a museum or a world power that possesses everything. There's no total, because things are always expanding or growing or changing, right? What does it mean to know everything or possess everything? Who knows now? And so that's part of it, the being against a totalization. There's also being against a teleology. So if you think of telos, you might not know telos, but you know television, telescope, telephone, telegraphy. Anyway, there's a bunch more I'm sure you can think of. Telos is basically, I think of it as like a line going to its destination, right? So you call somebody, phone line goes to the destination. You use a telescope to see, it goes to the star or whatever it is you're looking at. Being against the teleology means you're not focused, or you're against this idea of a straight line to your specific ends, whatever that end goal is. Instead, it's sort of like you can go in any direction, right? So there's this idea that if you can know everything, we're going towards full knowledge. But if you can't know everything, then where do you go if you're trying to learn stuff, right? We're not saying you can't learn anything. We're just saying that in our culture, things are so difficult and probably impossible to know everything or to possess everything that you need to move in a different direction than like towards the totality. And so there's no clear direction, which means you can play, which is fun, but also scary if you're somebody who's trying to know everything or possess everything or find some kind of totality. And so being against teleology means, let's say, you know, up until modernism, the idea was every year we get better at art as a civilization, right? Every year. And you can kind of see it, right? You think of caveman paintings who aren't very great, you know, in terms of like the way that they represent the world is not, you know, what the eye sees. But then we got to photography and we got to photorealistic painting. And so now what do we do? Are we done? Like, is art finished? Probably not, right? We go in these weird, different, divergent directions, but there's no clear direction where art should go, right? When we think of buildings, right? You might think like the bigger the building, the better. And so, but now we have skyscrapers, and that's not really the goal for humanity. And so we have design, but some buildings are based on, as you'll see, you know, random things, random objects. They're made to look pretty as opposed to be the biggest, strongest building. And so we don't know where we're going as architects, right? There's no direction that says, you know, every year we get closer to the best thing. And you might think maybe cell phones, for example. Every year they get better and better and better, right? But for a long time, cell phones were trying to get smaller. Now they're not so much, and they're trying to get sort of bigger, or, you know, you actually pay more for the extra large version of your cell phone, right? But then, you know, in 5-10 years, it's not like we can follow the direction and cell phones will have gone closer to that end goal. The goal will change, right? Maybe we'll have holograms, or maybe we'll have whatever, but it's not a clear direction. It's more like a bunch of experiments, and that's what culture is doing more broadly, with art, with technology, with everything. And then finally, there's this kind of idea of being against utopia. So if you can know and possess everything, if you can work towards the end goal, like become, as a civilization, the perfect artists, the perfect architects, the perfect theoreticians, we'll have a utopia. But if we don't know where the fuck we're going, how to get there, and we're going in all these different directions because there's no teleology, then we're probably not going to get, we're not going to get to a utopia, right? Things will keep changing, but it's not like every year they get worse or every year they get better. There's no clear direction. And that all of this is scary, which is why I think a lot of people don't like postmodernism as a philosophical or theoretical framework. But it's also liberating because there's a lot of room for play, because nobody can say that is not in the right direction. If you can argue that, no, I think this is the right direction, then maybe it is. But maybe it isn't, because there's never any like definitive, this is true, this is false. And so the only other term, I know I've thrown a lot of terms at you, but the last term is bricoleur or bricolage. All these guys, a lot of them were men and a lot of them were French, and so you get a lot of French terms. But a bricoleur in France is somebody who's like a handyman who like makes things or fixes things, and you know, if you need help putting something together, the bricoleur will come and help you fix something, right? Maybe, you know, think of like Scotch tape and different utensils or utilities that are around us. That's what the bricoleur will use to fix or to make a makeshift, you know, solution. That's very different from the engineer. The engineer who does a blueprint and then comes up with this idea and then executes it, right? And so a lot of postmodernists are interested in this idea of bricolage. So getting together with the material you have and putting things together in new and interesting ways, as opposed to this idea of like, think about the best and the best direction and then move there and put your plans into action. No, culture, according to a lot of postmodernists, is more of a bricolage. You're taking stuff, putting it together in new ways. And then that leads to this whole argument, is bricolage creative or is it sort of plagiarism and copying, right? Because on one level, you're taking stuff that already exists. Like in the earlier example, right? you're taking a urinal and you're taking an art gallery and you're just putting them together. So some people will say, wow, that's really interesting. Other people will say, no, there was a urinal and there was an art gallery and you didn't do anything that great by putting it together. That's the big challenge of postmodernism is who's right? And how do you know they're right? And how can you make sense of this? So this is a big philosophical debate. And I know I've taken up a lot of time already and thrown a lot of words at you. And like I said, I think you can build on this yourselves. And that's what I'd like you to do, and you'll see. But I want you to just think about all of the things that we do regularly in our culture, mostly taking stuff, changing it in some way, or combining it in some new and interesting way, and then coming up with a new idea that will then be taken and combined in other ways. And we see this, if you think of your parents, and then your generation, and then maybe your children, or even your younger brothers or sisters' generations, they all do this. We all do this, right? And usually the people before say, no, that's not how you should be doing this. And then you say, well, fuck you, mom and dad. I'm going to play music in this way, or I'm going to do it in this way. I'm going to dress like this, right? But by the time you have kind of established that, if your age demographic establishes that, the younger ones will be like, oh, that's stupid. We're going to do it in this old way. And sometimes, yeah, they'll take old stuff. Like the Teddy Boys would wear these old Edwardian suits, but they would wear it in like a cool way, right? They would change it up. I'm sure you've seen that. Maybe, I don't know. That's one of the things I want you to do is explain to me some of those things you young hip kids are doing, how you're taking things, what you've taken, and rearranged in new and interesting ways. And again, we all do this. It's hard to say how it works or how it should work because we don't have a clear framework like we would if there was like a manual, if an engineer said, this is how culture works, we could either do the blueprint or not do the blueprint correctly. But that's not how culture works, according, again, to postmodernity. And so our styles, our ways of reading and writing, and that, translates into more than just literally reading and writing, but the way we watch TV, the way we produce TV, the way we make videos on apps and stuff. These are all ways of bricolage, of putting things together in new and interesting ways. And I don't know, I think you can have a lot of fun with it. I love postmodern ideas and thought, even though it can be definitely very scary and it can upset people. But I like how it upsets old people usually. And so, anyway, that's just something that's fun for me, is to upset old people. I like to do it. And by old people, I don't mean necessarily in age, but people who are like, that's not the way you should be theorizing. And that's what, in the 60s and 70s especially, postmodernists were doing, right? They were upsetting the older academics who were saying, no, you need to do this and this and this. Kind of like if you remember Matthew Arnold, who said, culture is this and this and this. And really what that meant for him was old white men should know this and tell you young kids what to do as a culture. And then, of course, that's not how culture worked. And people took things and did things, and we continue to. So that's kind of how postmodernists see the world. You may disagree, which is totally fine. And in fact, you may, even if you're younger than me, feel older than me, like you're trying to conserve this older culture and you don't like the way that postmodernists are taking things and playing with them and treating them less seriously, perhaps. And that's totally fine. It's difficult to talk about and it's difficult to play with, but I want you to try because I think you'll get more out of it. I know I get more out of life in general, but out of pop culture especially, right? If I'm seeing a movie and I'm thinking through some of these ideas from Baudrillard, from Stuart Hall, who we'll talk about next week, from a lot of cultural studies theorists like Dick Hebdige here, it can be a fun and interesting and enlightening, a new way of being enlightening, different than the older, hundreds of years old enlightenment that we might be thinking about. So I want you to just engage with this, answer some of these questions as best you can, and remember, after this, there's just one more reading, and it's not even supposed to be a hard reading or anything. It's kind of like a conclusion reading. Anyway, have fun or don't. I don't know which direction we should go or what the best direction is. That's for us to make up on our own and to recombine and reconstruct those things as we go. But try to have fun as a postmodern. Try to play as a postmodernist and see what you learn. Until next time, cheers.